Right, good afternoon and welcome to the final webinar in the Legal Leadership Series, Resilience, Risks and Rapid Recovery, presented today by Sven Hansen and Bradley Hook of the Resilience Institute and hosted by myself, Alex Wakelin of LexisNexis. Today's webinar will look at the concept and practices of resilience, how resilience fails and how to recover, and strategies to support your resilience such as tactical calm, sleep, fitness and daily practice of self-care. Just before I hand over to Bradley and Sven for what I know is going to be a really interesting presentation, a couple of housekeeping matters. The webinar is recorded. The recording will be made available to attendees after the event, along with a workbook and recognition of your attendance for CPD purposes. A reminder to turn off your mobile phones or turn to flight mode to avoid interference with your audio experience. We encourage participants to ask questions during the presentation. You can do, and one of the great benefits obviously of this webinar format is that you can be relatively discreet about posing challenging questions or things you might be less inclined to pose in an open forum, a more visual forum. You can submit questions using the chat function. You'll find this on the right-hand side of your page. It's a little blue box that looks like a question. It looks like a conversation box. And if you submit the questions to all panelists, that will just be seen by myself, Bradley and Sven. If you're happy to share more widely, please send through to all participants. And finally, there will be a survey that pops up at the end of the webinar. We ask you to please complete it to assist us with our efforts to continually improve these events. And now to introduce you to today's presenters. Dr. Sven Hansen is the founder of the Resilience Institute and a medical practitioner who has pioneered preventative medicine, stress mastery, emotional intelligence and cognitive training. As a recognised leadership trainer and conference presenter in New Zealand, Australia and Asia, his key message is the imperative to integrate physical, emotional, cognitive and moral resilience. Sven qualified as a doctor in 1986 and went on to complete an MBA in 1993. Bradley Hook is the General Manager of the Resilience Institute and a resilience consultant with a background in digital technology, journalism, media and e-learning solutions. He has worked internationally in a range of technical and creative roles before moving to New Zealand. Brad has created a number of learning tools, including the award-winning MeCentral.com. Sven and Bradley, thank you so much for joining us today, and let me hand over to you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks very much.
Welcome, team.
Hi, everyone out there. Thanks for joining us. And as Alex mentioned, please do feel free to ask us questions using the chat window on the right-hand side. Really happy to answer you during the course of the webinar. So to kick off, the Resilience Institute has been around since 2002. We have a background in preventative medicine, neuroscience, positive psychology, high-performance sport, bringing together lots of different ideas from different fields into an integral model of resilience. You can see that spiral on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's kind of what we call our resilience diagnostic and development model. It allows us to describe the various phases that people experience in their lives, and we'll look at some of that today in this webinar. So in terms of our content flow for today, we are going to look at the concept and practice of resilience, defining what resilience actually is. We'll look at how to balance in adversity, what we call our downward spiral. We'll take a quick look at tactical calm, sleep and fatigue, and fitness, and pulling it all together into a daily practice. So getting started, resilience, when we first began many years ago, was hardly used, the term resilience. Now you'll find it everywhere, from global conferences to school mission statements, even to skin creams. So what does resilience actually mean? Feel free to post through your definition using the chat window if you would like to. I've got it open here. It's always interesting to see the different perspectives on resilience. And while you type it in, I'll tell you a few of the definitions we hear in our work. Some people think of resilience as that idea of grit, just pushing through a tough, challenging situation. Some people think of resilience in, almost a scientific way. In particle physics, it's the ability of a material to return to its original form, that elasticity. Some people think just of strength or perseverance. From our perspective, we like to look at it from 4 elements, which are all interconnected, all relate to each other, but all really, really important. So I'll just continue as I wait and see if anyone sends through a chat message. Feel free to. Our definition of resilience really incorporates this idea of bounce. It's really important. The learned ability to navigate through tough situations, to ideally bounce forwards rather than bounce back, to know that most challenges are transient and that we can get through. We've got the skills that we need to get through, and that's what we're going to concentrate the first part of this presentation on. Next is that idea of growth. Do you have the courage to challenge yourself and get out of your comfort zone? You may have heard of the growth mindset, and we often say the difference between an expert in a field and someone who is just learning is that the expert sees a lot more options. We can continue to grow throughout our lives, and fields such as epigenetics and neuroplasticity show that this is biological as well as more metaphorical growth. Connection, a huge part of our resilience. Are we able to connect with the people that we care about? Are we part of a circle where people can connect with us, who can rely on us? It's a huge part of our resilience and really important to leadership as well. And finally, flow. Flow state, as defined in positive psychology, is really those moments when you get into the zone. Some of you will have experienced this. If you've ever played a musical instrument or played sports or done anything creative, you'll find that you have those moments where you completely slip into a state of timeless awareness. You become the activity. It's a really pleasurable experience, a peak experience, they call it. Now, this can happen in work. Sometimes you'll get home at the end of the day and go, wow, that was a great day. I was really in flow. Things just worked out, and you have more energy than when you began. Elite athletes are paid to get into flow. It's a huge part of high performance. So being able to get into flow really is one of the outcomes of resilience training, and our approach helps people to cultivate the conditions for flow and even team flow within organizations. So let's continue onwards. Now, we often describe challenges in the modern world, and we use this device. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's been around since 1908. It was popularized by Hansen and even used by David Grossman in his book on combat. It describes how we respond to pressure, to performance. Now, our objective really is to reach that high performance, nudge into that peak zone from time to time and do our best work, but make sure that we rest and recover. If we spend too long in that peak performance, we can drift across the curve into distress. The body may start showing symptoms of distress, and we can even experience failure, the bottom of the spiral. We'll look at that in a minute. Our objective is to try and spend more time in flow. Now, if you think of those elite athletes, they train into distress. They push themselves so that they can move their performance levels continually upward on that curve. In the modern workplace, many of us don't have that kind of training, and we certainly don't have the recovery regimens that elite athletes have. You know, they take special care after big games where they've been hitting their peak to recover, to relax, and to come back down to biological rejuvenation on the left-hand side. Now, no one wants to slide off this graph into apathy or boredom. It's not good for our health. I think that a really useful way of looking at how we respond to the pressure of life is trying to ride that wave of biological rejuvenation, relaxation, into flow, hitting our peak performance from time to time, and riding back down into relaxation, and skillfully making our way up and down the left-hand side of that curve, knowing that every now and then we do need to press into distress. You know, if you think back to those cave divers in Thailand, they train into code black. People like that have to train into failure. But for most of us, it's more important just to utilize our skills effectively, take lots of time to recover, and that's something that Sven will walk us through in a minute. So we use this resilience diagnostic and development model to describe resilience. The bottom half, the downward spiral, is really all about our safety, including our psychological safety. The middle two levels are all about our well-being, staying calm, learning how to energize our body, things that we'll cover today. And the top are all about our effectiveness. Are we able to connect to others? Are we able to focus? Are we able to achieve flow in our lives and in our work? We look at resilience from 4 distinct lenses. The first is insight. Are we able to detect where we are on the spiral at any time? And we have a resilience app that we use, so that it includes a diagnostic tool, and people use this to just check in and see how they're traveling. It's a really important question. Not many of us stop and consciously ask ourselves, how am I doing? Do I really know? In some of our research, we discovered that in a survey of 300 executives, that around about 80 were at the bottom of the spiral, and only 5 knew about it. Insight gives us the opportunity just to check in with ourselves and know how we're doing. Mastery is the ability to execute the skills we need to get up the spiral, to move up to wherever it is that we need to be, to perform at our best, to have a good life, to enjoy our life with our colleagues at home, with our families. And empathy is about starting to recognize how other people are traveling. In your interactions, trying to think of other people's spiral. I wonder where they are on their journey, and adapting so that we have more constructive relationships with those we care about. And influence, many of you are leaders or will become leaders. Influence is all about expanding our circle, moving towards more constructive outcomes, the kinds of outcomes that will serve our families, our workplace, our communities better, so we can work towards more meaningful lives. So I'm going to move into the downward spiral. Feel free to ask any questions as we go along. We often find ourselves in a state of real busyness in the modern world. If you think back to evolution, our brain started off quite simple. We had a spinal cord with the base of the brain, think amphibians, and then a reptilian brain wrapped around that, and a mammalian brain, and much more recently, maybe the last 250,000 years, we've started using this new part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. It is what enables us to have abstract thought, to be logical, to join webinars like this. It's what we get paid for using in the modern workplace. However, it becomes quickly overloaded. Some suggest that we've fallen behind the evolutionary curve. We've got this information density around us, and we're trying our best to deal with it, but there is a lot going on, and that prefrontal cortex part of the brain can quickly become overloaded. We call confusion a cognitive risk. It's a risk to our effectiveness, and it happens fast. You've probably been in that situation where you've got lots of browser windows open, you've got push notifications on your phone, people tapping you on the shoulder. We can quickly feel quite ineffective. As we drift down the spiral, and this can happen pretty fast, we can experience what we term disengaged. This is a cognitive failure. It's when you experience what are sometimes known as attention blinks. You might be in a conversation with someone, you are engaged, and then suddenly you drift off. It might be rumination about the past, it might be anxiety about the future, it might just be some other place. You come back, their mouth is still moving, and you realize, uh-oh, I wasn't there, and you try and piece together whatever might have happened in between. Happens often, right? It's something that we just need to be aware of. There's also those moments when you might be driving and just drift off into those places and come back and go, oopsie, I don't really remember getting home. We can quickly become disengaged. Now, some of you might have heard about the study of judges being in the legal world. I'm sure some of you have. Now, Shai Danziger and his team in Israel wanted to assess whether there was any bias between Israeli and Arab parole applicants. They studied, it was a longitudinal study. They spent around 1,100 hours observing the outcomes of these court cases. And at the end of it, they discovered that there was no bias. Great result, except when they mapped it in a different kind of way. And what you'll see on the screen right now is that if you were first into court in the morning, you had about a 70% chance of being granted parole. This dipped quite quickly until tea break, when you had around about a 60% chance of being granted parole. Again, a rapid decline until the judges were a little more refreshed after their lunch break. Your chances went up, and then really not much point going to court after that. The judges had disengaged. Were they making decisions based on their blood sugar levels, based on fatigue? Those decisions after lunch and at the beginning of the day, were they even the right decisions? Or were the judges just in a more positive mindset? Interesting, right? And something to be aware of in our busy schedules. Are we working to align with our biological rhythms, things like the ultradian rhythm? It's really important to think about when we schedule meetings, that 3 p.m. meeting, are we refreshed? Are we able to make decisions clearly, or are we slipping into that disengaged state? So as we continue our movement down the spiral, we can sometimes become withdrawn. This often happens after perhaps we've made a mistake. Sometimes you have that horrible moment at 2 in the morning when you wake up and go, oh my dear, I didn't do that thing that I was meant to do. And you have angry emails in the morning, and we avoid or procrastinate. This happens fast, and we withdraw. It's a safety mechanism. We just put our heads down and try and avoid being noticed. It happens fast. We call that an emotional risk. And then as we move down the spiral, and remember, this doesn't always happen in these exact patterns. It can happen in different ways, but we do notice some patterns in the work that we do. We can become what we call vulnerable. It's an emotional failure in some ways. This is where we give up some of those things that are usually quite important to us. You know, we've been feeling flat, we've been feeling overloaded. It is much easier to go to the pub than it is to, say, go to hot yoga. We might not sleep very well and decide that we'll hit the snooze button and not take our dog for that morning walk. And this is where some of those the physical structure of some of our lifestyle habits falls apart, and sometimes exercise, sleep, nutrition suffers, and things like alcohol consumption might increase. We lose connection with others when we become vulnerable. As we move down the spiral, the body steps in, and we call this distress. This is where we start to experience things like asthma, or it could be eczema, or it could be those irritable bowel or the headaches. Everyone has distress in different ways. Our body becomes inflamed, and what we usually do is we go to the pharmacist, get a pill or a cream, and we try and mask some of those symptoms. It's kind of like having an alarm on the factory wall, and we rip it off and continue working the factory. It's not a great approach, because we're not dealing with whatever it was that was actually causing some of the issues. So the downward spiral, this can happen fast. Sometimes it can happen in the space of a day, or sometimes it can happen very, very gradually over weeks or months or even years. It's just important that we start to identify some of these distress symptoms, because it enables us to take action. At the bottom of the spiral, we use it as a bit of a placeholder, that word depressed. It doesn't necessarily have to be depression. It could be a health issue, a major health issue. It could be clinical depression. If there have been 5 or more symptoms for more than 2 weeks, at this point, our body is kind of kicking into we just feel extremely flat. We don't feel well. This can happen quickly. Imagine a very busy day. I'm feeling confused. I'm disengaging. I'm ruminating about the past, having anxieties about the future. Suddenly, I'm feeling really flat. I decide I'm not going to go and do that gym session that really makes me feel good. And before I know it, I'm not sleeping well, I've got that eczema, and I'm at the bottom of the spiral, just not feeling well at all. We sometimes say, if you haven't been to the bottom of the spiral at least 3 times in your life, you're probably not trying hard enough. Give it a whirl. Some of our most creative work happens when we hit the bottom. We make changes that can impact the rest of our lives, some of those really positive changes. So it's really important to remember that the bottom of the spiral is a place that we all find ourselves from time to time. And there's a reason why we use a spiral instead of a table, because this is constantly moving. It's a fluid map of resilience. We don't attach any stigma to these stages. We just say, what are some very quick, practical things we can do to get ourselves to wherever it is we need to be? So let's have a look at moving back up the spiral. And at the bottom, it's really important to get help. It's sometimes difficult to move from the bottom of the spiral upwards without help from a professional. A clear diagnosis is very important. Cognitive behavioral therapy or reframing can be really useful, more effective in some circumstances than medication, but really sorting out our exercise and sleep and maybe getting a coach to help us is a really important part of that bounce when we hit the rock bottom. As we move up the spiral, distress, the body is calling out. We sometimes say it's a compassionate call from the body. Brad, here's that eczema. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to look after me? And the answer is yes. Seek help, define the symptoms, go and see the dermatologist, go and find out what's going on, get some counseling. But really importantly, things like yoga and massage, disconnecting from the busy world can make a real difference as we've drifted down that spiral. Often our sleep is quite broken when we get there. Taking some time out for things like meditation, if that resonates for you, can be really useful as well. As we get to that emotional failure, the vulnerable level of the spiral, we'll sometimes say, how about taking some time out, a long weekend with no devices? Just that idea gives some people anxiety in itself. So a long weekend, maybe with limited use of the devices. Going camping, a well-being initiative, going to a health spa, for example, having a massage. It's not yet permissible to have your mobile phone looking through the little hole of the massage table. So I think a massage is a great way just to force yourself to disconnect for a little while, find some space in a very busy world. But sorting out our sleep, trying to go to sleep earlier than we have been, can be a great first step to that renewal. And we'll look at sleep in a little more detail today because it's something that many, many people are struggling with in this busy world full of lots of light pollution. Moving up the spiral, when we withdraw, when we notice someone in our team withdraw, it's important just to connect. The All Black rugby team have this practice whereby when the coach sees someone withdraw, maybe they dropped a pass in the game, maybe they didn't do so well in practice, they have a cup of tea together. He sends someone from the team to have a cup of tea. The coach doesn't intervene. And it's proven to be really, really successful in that a problem shared, a problem halved, all of that. But just connecting, reconnecting is super important for us humans. We are very social animals. And as we move up the spiral to that disengaged level, we're having those attention blinks. Remember the judges. We're starting to feel fatigued as the day wears on. Taking a break, just standing up, doing some stretches, drinking some coffee, probably not after 2 p.m. if you have trouble sleeping. For many cultures around the world, coffee is one of the main sources of antioxidants in our diet. A low-carb snack, we don't want to be experiencing sugar spikes during the day, so some nuts or some fruit or a piece of avocado, really good snacks. Going for a walk, walking around the office block can be hugely beneficial. Some sunlight, some vitamin D, and a breath of fresh air all can really help us refresh. Very simple things that we all know, but they can make a big difference. Imagine if those judges had taken a moment to refresh before each of those cases. What might the outcome have been? And at that confused level, we live in a busy world, information density. Can we simplify? Are we able to step back the day before and define 1, 2, or 3 key priorities for the next day? Now, this may sound simplistic in itself, but if we focus on those really important goals, sometimes we may drop the ball with some other things, but really focus on building up momentum by completing our key tasks. It really leads to a feeling of satisfaction. We feel like things are going well, being really disciplined about working on one thing at a time. Multitasking, for the most part, is extremely ineffective. Imagine a web browser. You've got your computer open, you've got your web browser, lots of tabs running, you've got lots of programs open all at the same time, all with their own notifications. The whole computer system slows down. So if you like that kind of technology metaphor, your prefrontal cortex is your working memory, your RAM. It gets quickly overloaded and the whole system slows down. I sometimes like to visualize closing all of those excess programs and having one thing open and really focusing in on that. So that's the spiral. Does anyone have any questions? Can anyone share some examples of how they've experienced any of these stages? For example, confusion. How do you know when you're really overwhelmed at work? Or is this just the default, as it is for many people in the working world? Feel free to contribute and send myself and Dr. Sven a message, because we're really happy to talk through some of these ideas. Alrighty. I'll continue onwards so that we get plenty of time for the sleep section, because many people who undertake our training are very keen to hear about some practical tips and techniques for getting a good night's sleep. So really, we look at this response to challenge curve again. I would I would encourage all of you to try and visualize this, to try and find ways to go from relaxation, move into flow. So flow requires very clear objectives, minimal distractions, and you experience that timelessness, real absorption in the task. And then moving back down to rejuvenation. And rejuvenation can come from a few minutes of tactical breathing, something we're going to look at next. Or it could be a walk around the park or around the building, a breath of fresh air. Every now and then knowing that we need to achieve our peak performance, we need to get into that code red. And from time to time, we want to get stronger. We'll nudge into distress. We'll push ourselves to the limit and actually learn from those experiences. Remember the downward spiral. It's a hugely important part of resilience. And 50% of your bounce comes from insight, from just recognizing where I am on that spiral. So for example, if I go, oh, I'm feeling really flat, it's been a busy few days, I'm going to go to the pub instead of going to that hot yoga class, that's when I catch it. That's when I go, actually, Brad, you are at that vulnerable level. I'm going to make an effort to go to that yoga class. I'm going to catch it before it happens. And usually you feel really great for having done that. That's rapid bounce in a nutshell. This is all inside of the workbook, which Alex has sent to you. So I encourage you to refer back. There's lots of resources in there. And just try and apply some of your own language to the downward spiral. So I'm going to hand this over to Sven, and he's going to talk us through staying safe, calm, present, our idea that we call tactical calm. So handing over to you, Sven. And I'll just pass over the presenter rights.
Great, super. Thanks, Brad. Hi, guys. Brad, can you just confirm I'm loud and clear? Because I'm a long way away from you guys.
Now, Dr. Sven is actually, Dr. Sven is in Africa at the moment, and yeah, I'll let him continue. He might tell you a bit about it.
Yeah, so this is my bounce time. I come and hide in Africa with the animals, and that is the fastest way I know how to bounce. All right, so we'll pick from here, and I think, you know, one of the questions that sits with me, and I think is really useful because I imagine, you know, some of you might be parents. What age would you like a young person to understand that concept of bounce? It's a big issue, and one of the things that our school work is looking at the moment is the frightening increase in depression and anxiety symptoms amongst young people. Somewhere around 2010, 2011, 2012, we've seen an alarming spike where anxiety at sort of school and first-year university level in girls is up around 60%, and depression symptoms are up, overwhelming symptoms are up around 37%. So it's a huge issue, and people are very, very focused on it. And three things we'd like to kind of just at least phrase as we work up the spiral. The first is that our children are super safe, physically, but emotionally and mentally, they're really, really struggling. And when you look at this area of how do we improve these things, how do we have a stronger, more resilient population, there are probably three areas we should focus on. The first one is to be able to master stress. The second one, which many researchers believe is causative to many of the challenges today, is sleep. And we also know that a really good night's sleep is one of the keys to ensuring you can access that flow that Brad talked about. And the third one, and Brad kind of alluded to this, is your device time. That is now seen as causative. The average young person is spending approximately 6 hours a day on an internet-connected device. And from 2 hours per day, you start to see some real challenges in that downward spiral. So we're going to look at countering that in terms of how you put some structure into your day. So the first point is master stress. And I wonder if just, you know, talking about the idea, if you could all just look at your body. Are you sitting? Where are your shoulders? Can you feel any tension in your muscles? What about if you arch back, tuck your chin in a little bit, maybe grab your hands behind the chair, even stand up. Just arch your shoulders backwards and rotate to the left, rotate to the right. Exhale fully. Now, one of the things that you can look at that curve that Brad talked about is that we actually all have the ability to move up and down that curve quickly. And this is what many of us admire when we see our favorite dancers or athletes or musicians, is they seem very good at managing arousal. They can step onto a stage, a situation that will frighten most of us, and they can be really calm and really, really present. So we talk about the sort of first cluster of competencies as how to be able to quickly access being safe, being calm, and being fully present to the moment. Okay, so, this is excessive biology, but for those of you who are kind of interested, I'll just put this out there. As we've evolved from reptiles through to mammals, through to humans, we've actually changed. So, out here we have lots of snakes. Now, if you come across a snake in the bush, it has three options. One is it rolls over and it plays dead. That's called a freeze reaction. Now, in the office today, when we do that, that is normally when we can't speak or we burst into tears. All right? It's a very primitive reaction that's been with us approximately 60 million years. An alternative, if we're confronted and we've still got enough resources, is we're going to fight. Now, the snake rears up and it strikes. For us, it might be shouting, it might be pointing, it might be swearing. It may, in some situations, be violence, certainly verbal. And then the last option the snake has got is to run, which is always its preference. Now, we as humans have kept all of those systems. Now, the snake usually deals with an acute issue. As humans, we're dealing with relentless strikes, as Brad was saying, from the news, from your phone, from social media. And many of us go from little bursts of anxiety or flight to bursts of frustration or anger. And sometimes we just drop into apathy. We really want to run away and get out of it. Now, somewhere in mammals, we developed what's called the new part of the vagus nerve. So for those of you who want to know, the new vagus runs from the 10th cranial nerve, runs down through the neck, through the chest, and it interacts powerfully with the heart and with the lungs. When you activate that new vagus, you master the freeze, flight, and fight reactions. Humans can become very, very good at this. And the more you practice working that new vagus, the more resilient you become to those more primitive responses, the more possible it is for you to stay in that relaxed mode. It is also the doorway to intimacy. It's the key to play. As we know, the way we become strong, the way we become smart, the way we connect with others is to play as young people. And it is certainly the key to performance. So many of you will know this as mindfulness. We're a little nervous that term, and in some ways, I think the meditation advice that people like Noah Yuval Harari give, that we should all meditate for 2 hours per day, may be a little too much. So our sense of this is what if you could come up with something really, really simple? And at the core, it sits in our breathing. Every moment you've got this opportunity. So I recommend as you do this, let's sort of just try it and feel it. Place your hands in your low ribs over the belly, and then take a deep breath. And notice what happens. You'll probably find that your chest puffs up. Now, many of us say to people, when you're distressed, take a deep breath. It's actually very dangerous advice. One shouldn't use that. Because when you take a deep breath like that, you raise your heart rate, you raise your blood pressure, and you switch off that vagus nerve. Whereas if you hit that moment of anxiety and you exhale, you all try that. So really breathe out, out, out. Notice how your ribs close in. And then breathe in to the lower belly, the lower lung. And you should feel your ribs flare out like a bucket handle. That's using the diaphragm. The diaphragm is that lovely dome of semi-striated muscles that it's similar to heart muscle. It can work without you concentrating. But in the continual interruptions and challenges of our modern lives, the diaphragm freezes and we tend to hyperventilate. So roughly a third of people are breathing in the upper chest. And as you do that, you make the flight, fight, and freeze reactions much more likely. Every time you breathe out, every time you let that diaphragm relax upwards, you activate the vagus nerve. Your heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, and blood runs to that critical prefrontal cortex and have up to a 50% improvement in blood flow. You feel calm, you feel safe, and you're much more present, whether that is to a test, a conflict, difficult situation in the courtroom, a battle with someone at home. Right? And it's really practical, and every moment, every one of us have access to that. Our preferred language is to call this tactical calm. If you like the biological angle, you can call it training the vagal brake. All right, so there's a couple of simple points. As I said, you keep the spine nice and light and long. When your spine is light and long, the diaphragm can move. If you're hunched in your chair or collapsed in your chair, it's very difficult to work the diaphragm, and you default back to that hyperventilation of the deep breath at the top of the chest. Always drop your attention. So the meditators have a really lovely term. They call it a body-mind drop. When we get frustrated or anxious, we tend to be very in our heads. You probably find you're frowning. If you can just relax that tension out of your head and feel the body, feel the breath, feel the diaphragm move. Always use an exhale to slow the heart rate. And it appears, and we'll probably learn more over time, that if you can get an exhale extended to about 6 seconds, a very slight pause, and then a slow, low inhale for 4 seconds. That gives you a breath of 10 seconds. In other words, you'd be breathing 6 times per minute. The average out in society is between 12 and 18, which is highly abnormal. If you do this breathing through your nose, it further slows, humidifies, and warms the air, and it's both the in-breath and the out-breath through the nose. And for many people, you can connect this with a picture of your favorite beach or one of your loved ones on your desk. If you can access positive emotions, it really helps this process of triggering the vagal nerve. So this can be done really quickly, really simply. For those of you who use your Apple Watches and other wearables, most of them now have a little breathing app. If you were to simply be reminded on the hour to breathe slowly, calmly for 1 minute, you effectively start to enjoy some of the benefits that the meditators achieve. So it's kind of counterproductive. Many of us say rise to the challenge, and we gird ourselves up, and the blood comes to our fists and arms and our jaw. In fact, the key to performance is to calm down. It's to relax into it. The Navy SEALs have a really interesting saying: never rise to the challenge. Always think to the level of your training. Even if you're sitting on a telephone call and you're just not exactly sure how to play a situation, it can be a really good idea just to gently let your breath out. And use that calming, use the drop in the pulse rate, use the vagus nerve to rethink a situation, to step back, to see it in greater perspective, and to make a wise decision. Because remember that flight, fight, and fight response is always triggering you. And one of the big ones we have with many of our clients around the world is that so many people are struggling, as we'll hear about with sleep. If you could do this diaphragmatic breathing for a minute or two, as you fall asleep in the evening, you will drop into deeper sleep, and your sleep is way more likely to be sustained. Hypervigilance is that very active thinking mind that can drive us nuts in the quiet parts of the night. If you can learn to trigger that vagal response, you can learn to release your body into deep sleep. Very powerful idea, and really simple. And there's no challenging science here. It's straightforward. We know it works. We can measure it in your blood gases. We can measure it in your nerves. We can measure it in your brain. We can measure it in your immune system. So that's kind of one thing we'd suggest. Every day, find time to do this. The neurobiologists like Antonio Damasio and Richie Davidson, they're suggesting that roughly 8 minutes of this slow, easy breathing is enough to begin to create change in your immune system, in your thinking, and in your emotion control. 8 minutes is not a lot. Even if you were to give yourself 6 breaths every hour through the working day, you've done it. You may also want to do it in the morning, just taking a few minutes out in nature and to enjoy that moment to yourself. Stepping up. There are obviously lots of things, and we know how powerful exercise is, but we decided for this session we'll just really look at sleep. And sleep is complex. So I think there are 3 questions that can be really helpful to each of us to answer our own questions. When someone tells you if this is what you should do, we recommend you be suspicious. It's much more useful to ask questions. And the 3 questions are these. 1, how much sleep do you need? 2, what is the best time for you to go to sleep and the best time for you to wake up? And 3, how do you get quality in your sleep? So we're going to try and answer some of the science and give you some ways to look at that. Clearly, there are lots of very important things about sleep. As one of the sleep conferences beautifully put to us last year, when you get a good night's sleep, you wake up a better version of yourself. And it's really interesting, because when you do get a good night's sleep, you get the right amount of time for your body at the right time, in the right way. Your immune system is better, your brain is better, your muscles are better, your emotions are more dialed in. Right? So many, many benefits. And every time we compromise our sleep need, we wake up a worse version of ourselves. Sleep physiologists call this the catastrophe of time, and just important to remember that sleeping too long, there's much out in the media about this at the moment, is as dangerous and sometimes more dangerous than sleeping too little. Sleep need is biological. Every single one of us have a specific amount of sleep required. In my body, it's 7 hours, 22 minutes. Most of you will be around 7.5 hours. It's the single most important appointment every day. Book that sleep, and by simply tracking, you can very quickly work out what your sleep need is. You see that on Monday mornings, there's a huge increase in, not huge, but a significant and consistent increase in heart attacks, strokes, motor vehicle accidents, suicide. And the reason for that is the second question is about timing. And this, according to many researchers like Jean Twenge, is one of the key reasons our kids are in so much trouble. The sleep clock has been disrupted. So in simple terms, you can think of your sleep clock as during the day, we're warm, we're active, we're alert. At night, we're dark, cool, quiet. All primates are like this. The clock is roughly 30 million years old, so it's unlikely to change. And it's set by what's called zeitgebers. And the key zeitgeber for each one of us is the blue light of dawn. If you can get up at the right time in your day to capture that blue light before the sun goes up, you reset your clock and start fresh. And the second key part to this is to knowing how to cool down in the evening. Round about 9 p.m. we release melatonin. It helps your temperature drop, and it helps you slip into those deep sleep stages. Now, imagine if you are cooling down in front of your TV. You've got your phone next to you and your iPad, and maybe you answering a few emails on your laptop. And you take your phone to bed with you. What we're doing, most of us, is flooding our brains with blue light. Now remember, blue light really should be happening in the morning, not at night. You're actually moving your biological clock 12 hours every time you expose yourself to screens at night. Right, so two takeouts there. The first, try to get up with the blue light of dawn. And the second is set up a cool down routine, perhaps an hour, maybe 90 minutes, where you remove devices, you read a book, you choose yellow light, you have a conversation, you take a call. When this biological clock synchronizes with the sun and the night cycle, everything in your biology is better. And every time, even if you sleep in over the weekend, you disrupt this biology completely. And just like jet lag, it can take 5 to 7 days to recover. Now, if you can imagine how many of our young people are sitting in front of their computers at night, you're seeing one of the key reasons we've got problems. Right? The third question to look at is, are you getting quality? So if you go to bed after a good cool down routine, your brain, once every 24 hours, will drop down that cascade, if you like, from awake into stage 1, 2, 3, and then into the deep sleep. That should happen roughly between 9:30 and 11:30. If you're a lark, early to bed, early up, it's probably around about 9:30. If you're an owl, it's probably around 11, but not much later. Deep sleep is the one that counters anxiety. Deep sleep is what allows the hormones, the brain to recover, the muscles to recover. We get 2 cycles of deep sleep, and then 2, or for some people, 3 cycles of dreaming sleep. If you can drop into that deep cycle, your sleep is covered. All right? Hugely important, simple idea. So 3 questions on sleep. To work out between that 7 and 8 hours, what is your optimal sleep need? To make sure you get your clock, that circadian rhythm, lined up with your day, and making sure you've got the cool down and the wake up routines sorted. And for many of you will know the power of doing a 10 to 15 minute power nap is immense. So we won't go through the fitness piece there. Remember, and you'll see it in our social media, our European team has put something out on high intensity training, really 1 or 2 minutes a day. If you're fit, flexible, strong enough, and can do an awful lot to meet all of the gains of exercise. So kind of in concluding and opening up to questions, on the one side, as Brad said, is that insight, to understand some of these things, and we really haven't even begun with the emotional and the cognitive skills. But if you can see yourself, if you can pause every now and again through the day to check your mind, to check your emotions, check your body, the answers present. But if we don't take that time, it can be really easy to go down the spiral. And then kind of the second key thing is to understand rhythm. Brad talked about recovery rhythms that athletes and others use after big events. We operate well as humans with a rhythm, and each of us will have a different rhythm. So we talk about this concept of a daily practice rhythm, a sense of asking some questions of yourself. What are the things that really matter for me? It's easy, right? I really know that for me to sleep well is key. It is definitely my most important meeting. I actually 3:30 a.m. here, so I had to get up at 1:30 this morning. Now that's extremely dumb. All right, so I'm going to be taking a lot of care over the next few days to fix that sleep rhythm and to get a good night's sleep. Sleep is really important. I understand that exercise for me is really important, so I do it in some way or other. And I also understand, as Brad was saying, that concept of flow. Every day to think about what's one thing I could do that really would feel important, that's meaningful, that would give me a sense of accomplishment. because in the turbulence of activity, we can often end up like we've done a zillion things but completed none. So that'd be a third kind of key to my rhythm. And we really hope that you'll use this and use what's in the workbook to consider how you might build your own rhythm. Now, some of us can make big changes. Most of our suggestions and our successes, we think, come from people who make one at a time. You know, for example, the really big ones come from breathing, learning to do that most days. People find going to sleep a little bit earlier with a little less device time, transformative. Clearly exercise, you know, is right at the top of the list. You know, if you want to start out with something physical, perhaps stretching is a really, really good way to go. So guys, we're sort of at the end of the content. You know, we'll put this up as we start asking for questions. These are just, you know, we try to study what we do quite carefully, and this is the product of 21,000 diagnostics done mostly through 2017. And what we did here was to cluster the top 10% of people's resilience scores, the middle, and the bottom. And we asked the question, so what things really vary? So if we look at, you know, if you look at top left there, if you look at focus, if you're in the top scoring, most resilient person, you really practice that focus. It is a key part of your day. If you're down at the bottom of the spiral, focus just fades away. And you notice there, in terms of those top factors that really define people the most resilient: focus, purpose, fulfillment, optimism, vitality. Right? Sleep quality is quite way down, but bounces there. Right? Decisiveness is there, being present, which is partly being calm, is there. And then again, what is quite fascinating, if you look at risk factors for resilience, you know, for example, the top performers, they don't do fatigue, they don't do worry, they don't do self-critical, they don't do overload, apathy, or chronic symptoms. Whereas you can see it's become a part of life. All right, so Alex, thank you. Quick question there. How can you do it in teams? It's a wonderful question. I think, you know, one of the key roles of leadership is to think about this rhythm for your team. You know, if you go back to what Brad was saying about confusion and the need to be clear, you know, one of the key things a good leader does is to give clarity, that every day, every employee knows what thing, usually one thing, maybe two things, is important, and they get that done. I think another way leaders can do this is to make sure that there's a rhythm of work hard, rest, to make sure that tea breaks or walk and talk meetings are a part of what you do during the day. I think organizations worldwide now are step by step engaging these kind of programs into the workplace to help people understand the importance of their physical well-being, of their sleep, of their relaxation skills, emotional intelligence, thinking skills. So it's happening, and it's happening in schools, but we've got a long way to go. So guys, look, we're yours for a few minutes. If there are questions, please dial them up. And Brad, if there's anything you'd like to add, just yell out, and I'll switch the ball to you.
Oh, I'm happy to field some questions.
I've got one question here. Is there any recommendations on how to recognize, apart from on how to recognize you're moving from one stage to another, aside from, you know, being aware of those different stages? I was just thinking in terms of, you know, moving from vulnerable to distressed, for example.
Yeah, you know, we kind of suggest with this one, I think it's a really important piece of homework for anyone who wants to build their resilience, is to ask themselves, what does it feel like when I'm confused or disengaged or withdrawn? And maybe to have 3 or 4 words or even a phrase that help you remember, when I do that, I'm You know, for example, I know that I'm inclined, I did it yesterday. I went off for a walk in the bush by myself. I was withdrawing from family time. And to be sensitive to what you do at each of those stages gives you the speed to jump up. So, you know, for example, I don't want to be too sort of twee here, but when I withdraw from family or partner, make myself step forward and ask for a hug.
Yeah.
All right. So the key here is to understand what happens for you. We're all different. And I really hope that each one of you might go back and say, okay, what does confused look like in my life? In my life, it's sitting in, and my mind's just going from one thing to the next. That's confused. When that happens, I have to have a go-to. Concert FM. I turn it on straight away. So I think it's more, you know, each person's got to find out what their experience is, and then to practice over and over and again, making the shift up a level.
Right. Thank you. Well, it looks like we've got a reticent group here today, so
Oh, we've got a question.
If anyone's got any questions, please send them through now. But if not, I know we've got your email addresses at the end, and there's also, we'll send out the link to your site, and people can have a look around at some of the other options that you've got on there. We haven't sent out the workbook, just to make you aware yet, but everybody will get that after the event. So I will send that through along with the recording to everyone. But I think if we haven't got any more questions from the floor, we might leave it there. Thank you so much, Sven and Bradley. That's been fantastically informative, and I think, and I hope everybody's got as much out of it as I have. Yeah, look forward to spreading the word about get more sleep.
Yeah.
Make sure you enjoy these Christmas holidays.
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly what I was going to say.
It's a rare time in the year now that we can take a good chunk of time off. So I do hope all of you protect this time for yourself, for your families, for your body, for your emotions, for your mind, and allow Christmas to be a time of great recovery, rejuvenation, bring you back next year stronger and more resilient.
Yeah. And if you need some tips, we've published an infographic on our website at resilienceeye.com/holidays. I encourage you to have a look. It's got some of what we covered today and a few other things that we cover in other workshops. So all the best for the holidays.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Thanks for everyone who's joined us today. Just to reiterate, we'll send you the recording and the workbook and a record of attendance. And finally, if you could complete the survey that pops up at the end, we'd be very grateful. It just helps us do better next time. But thank you all. Good afternoon and goodbye.
See you.
Thank you all.
Bye.